About a week ago, I was telling some funny stories about working for Dave Milley, who was the pastor of a very successful church in suburban Boston back in the 1980s. And Dave was a very dynamic, he's still alive, he's a very dynamic guy, but he had a very diverse personality. His moods could go all over the place, and you kind of never knew sometimes what kind of mood he was going to be in. But one time he had been away on a missions trip, and it was in the winter. He was away about 10 days. And we had a secretary at that time. She was probably about the age I am now, which is 55. But Shirley, who was the secretary, she would be hot. She would be cold on a hot day. I remember one time in the summer, it was 100 degrees out, and she was wrapped up in a blanket shivering, so she was always cold. So here it was winter, and we had trouble with the heating system in that part of the building. It was a large church building. There was actually several heating and AC units for the building. We had a lot of trouble with the unit that covered the office area, and it kept breaking down. There was a repairman from Rhode Island named, I don't know his real name. His nickname was Sarge. And you'd have to call on the phone and get Sarge and get him to come and fix the system. Well, the system kept breaking down while Dave Milley was away this time in the winter. And the office temperature would go down in the 50s, maybe even in the 40s. And the other associate pastor was Denny Seller. We were both in our mid-20s at the time. And we just kind of wore our coats and dealt with it. But Shirley was very unhappy. What we didn't know is when Dave Milley came home, Shirley told him that we had done a terrible job while he was away, and that the office was ice cold, and we let it be ice cold and just had done a terrible job. So Dave Milley called Denny and I into his office, and he was absolutely furious. When he was furious, he would be grabbing at his belt. His nostrils would spread apart, and he'd be grabbing at his belt, and he'd even point with a couple of fingers, and he'd be yelling. And boy, he was all upset about what Shirley had told him. Well, the problem was Denny and I had kept trying to reach Sarge on the phone, and you know this is pre-cell phones, but you call up and maybe you get an answering machine or something, and you leave a message. And we had been calling and saying we had an emergency, we had no heat, and he just wasn't responding. Or he may have come once and fixed it and it didn't work again. But, you know, we kept calling him and calling him. Well, that wasn't good enough for Dave Milley. And Dave Milley looked at us and said, you didn't do a good job trying to get a hold of him. And I said, well, what do you mean? We tried, we left messages and whatnot. And he said, you harass him! Literally said, you harass him. And I looked at him and I said, well, how are you supposed to harass him? You know, if you can't get him on the phone, how are you supposed to harass him? And he said, you call him at 12 midnight. You call him at 2 a.m. You harass him! So a number of years later, when Dave Milley was leaving that church, I was no longer there, but they had a special night to roast him. And I came back and I told 3 funny stories. I was one of the roasters. Told 3 funny stories about Dave Milley. But that was one. I've never forgotten you harass him. And actually, folks, in the wintertime, if you have no heat, in the summertime, if you have no AC, if you don't know how to get a hold, if you're having trouble getting hold of your repair person, remember Dave Milley's advice. If you want to make sure that repair person shows up, call him up and you harass him!